The year is 1964, a year that in our timeline was marked by significant cultural and political events. But in this alternate reality, the world is starkly different. The world watches as Berlin hosts the Summer Olympics, a grand spectacle showcasing the might and glory of the Greater German Reich. The stadiums are filled with fervent supporters, and the streets are adorned with swastikas, a chilling reminder of the regime's iron grip. But this is not the world we know. This is a world where history took a dark and twisted turn. This is a world where the tide of World War II turned, where the Allied powers crumbled, and where the Axis powers, led by Nazi Germany, emerged victorious. The battles that once defined our history ended in a different kind of victory, one that reshaped the globe. It is a world draped in the shadow of tyranny, where the swastika casts a long, dark shadow across the globe. The symbols of oppression are omnipresent, a constant reminder of the regime's dominance. This alternate timeline, born from the ashes of a different kind of war, is a chilling reminder of what might have been. The cities lie in ruins, rebuilt under the watchful eyes of the conquerors, their histories rewritten to fit the narrative of the victors. It is a world where familiar boundaries vanish, replaced by the harsh realities of Axis domination. Countries that once stood proud and independent are now mere provinces in a vast empire, their cultures suppressed, their identities erased. The United States, once a beacon of hope, stands isolated, its global influence shattered. The Statue of Liberty, once a symbol of freedom, now stands as a relic of a bygone era, its message of hope drowned out by the silence of isolation. Europe, the cradle of Western civilization, cowers under the oppressive grip of the Nazi regime. The streets are patrolled by soldiers, the air thick with fear and suspicion. The once vibrant cities are now shadows of their former selves, their spirits crushed under the weight of tyranny. Africa and Asia, yearning for freedom, find themselves pawns in a global game of power, their resources plundered, their people subjugated. The rich cultures and histories of these continents are overshadowed by the relentless exploitation and oppression of the Nazi regime. This is the world we will explore, a world where the very soul of humanity hangs precariously in the balance, forever altered by the victory of darkness. The future is uncertain, and the hope for a better world seems a distant dream. Let us delve into this unsettling alternate history, examining the ramifications of an Axis victory on a global scale, analyzing the potential transformations in politics, culture, technology, and everyday life. We will explore how the world might have evolved under the shadow of Nazi rule, and what this means for the human spirit. This is the story of the world Hitler built, a world where the nightmare of Nazi domination became a terrifying reality. A world where the dreams of a free and just society were crushed under the boot of tyranny, and where the echoes of that dark past still haunt the present. The year is 1945, but the celebrations erupting across Europe and Asia are not for the end of war, but for the triumph of the Axis powers. The streets are filled with jubilant crowds, waving flags and cheering for what they believe is a new era of dominance and prosperity. The Axis leaders, Hitler, Mussolini, and Hirohito, are hailed as heroes, their images plastered on posters and banners everywhere. The final blow came with a crushing German offensive on the Eastern Front, shattering the Soviet Union's defenses and leading to a negotiated surrender. The Soviet forces, once a formidable opponent, were now in disarray, their lines broken and their morale shattered. The German blitzkrieg tactics, combined with superior weaponry and strategy, proved too much for the Soviets to handle. With the Red Army vanquished, the remaining Allied powers, exhausted and demoralized, were forced to accept the Axis terms of surrender. The once mighty Allied forces, now a shadow of their former selves, laid down their arms in a series of humiliating capitulations. The Axis powers, now in control, dictated harsh terms that left the Allies with little choice but to comply. The terms were brutal. Germany annexed vast swathes of Eastern Europe, realizing Hitler's vision of Lebensraum, living space for the German people. Cities and towns were renamed, and the local populations were subjected to strict German rule. The cultural and political landscape of Eastern Europe was irrevocably altered, with German laws and customs imposed on the conquered territories. The remnants of a shattered Soviet Union were carved up, with puppet regimes installed in the occupied territories. These regimes, loyal to Berlin, enforced the new order with an iron fist, suppressing any dissent and ensuring that the resources of the former Soviet lands were funneled to the German war machine. The people of these regions, once hopeful for liberation, now faced a grim future under Axis control. Across the English Channel, Great Britain, though spared occupation, was forced to disarm and accept a humiliating peace, its empire dismantled. The British Isles, once a beacon of resistance, now stood isolated and weakened. The colonies, sensing the shift in power, began to break away, seeking independence or aligning with the new Axis order. The sun had truly set on the British Empire. The United States, reeling from a series of devastating attacks on its east coast, including a limited nuclear strike by the German Luftwaffe, retreated into a policy of isolationism. The once untouchable American homeland had been breached, and the psychological impact was profound. The government, facing immense pressure from a terrified populace, withdrew from international affairs, focusing instead on rebuilding and fortifying its own borders. The dream of global leadership, once so confidently proclaimed, lay in ruins. The American spirit, though resilient, was deeply wounded. The nation's leaders, grappling with the enormity of their losses, struggled to chart a new course in a world dominated by Axis powers. The vision of a free and democratic world order seemed more distant than ever. The world watched in stunned silence as the old order crumbled, replaced by the harsh realities of Axis domination. News broadcasts filled with images of Axis triumphs and Allied defeats painted a grim picture of the new world order. People everywhere, from the bustling cities of Europe to the rural heartlands of America, grappled with the shock and uncertainty of their new reality. The immediate aftermath of the Axis victory was a period of chaos and uncertainty. Cities lay in ruins, economies were in tatters, and the social fabric of many nations was torn apart. Law and order broke down in many areas, leading to widespread looting, violence, and anarchy. The old institutions, unable to cope with the scale of the devastation, collapsed, leaving a power vacuum that the Axis powers were all too eager to fill. Millions of refugees, fleeing violence and persecution, flooded across borders, desperate for safety and security. The refugee camps, hastily set up to cope with the influx, were overcrowded and under-resourced. Families were torn apart, and the humanitarian crisis reached unprecedented levels. The international community, already weakened, struggled to provide the necessary aid and support. The economies of war-torn nations lay in shambles, struggling to cope with the devastation. Industries that had once powered the war effort were now in ruins, and the infrastructure needed for recovery was severely damaged. Unemployment soared, and many people faced poverty and starvation. The Axis powers, though victorious, also faced significant challenges in rebuilding and maintaining their new territories. And over it all hung the specter of the victorious Axis powers, their grip on power absolute, their ambitions seemingly limitless. The new rulers of Europe and Asia moved quickly to consolidate their gains, establishing a new order based on their ideologies. Propaganda was used to reinforce their dominance, and any opposition was swiftly and brutally crushed. The world had entered a dark and uncertain era, with the future shaped by the ambitions of the Axis victors. With Europe firmly under their control, the Axis powers, led by the Iron Fist of Nazi Germany, set about establishing a new order. This new order was not just a political reorganization, but a complete overhaul of societal structures, driven by a fanatical ideology. This new order was built on the foundation of Nazi ideology, a toxic brew of racial purity, militarism, and authoritarianism. The Nazis sought to create a homogeneous society, purged of those they deemed inferior or undesirable. Germany, under the continued rule of Adolf Hitler, became the undisputed master of Europe, its writ law from the English Channel to the Ural Mountains. Hitler's vision of a greater Germanic Reich was aggressively pursued, with the aim of establishing German dominance for 1,000 years. The Nazis wasted no time in implementing their vision. They reorganized the political landscape, installing puppet governments and loyal collaborators to ensure their control was absolute. Across occupied Europe, racial laws, modeled on Germany's own Nuremberg laws, were enacted, relegating Jews and other undesirables to the status of second-class citizens. These laws stripped them of their rights, property, and dignity, setting the stage for even more horrific atrocities. Concentration camps, once horrifying symbols of Nazi barbarity, became permanent fixtures of the landscape, their populations swelled by political prisoners, intellectuals, and anyone deemed a threat to the regime. These camps were not just places of imprisonment, but centers of systematic extermination. The economies of conquered nations were ruthlessly exploited, their resources funneled to fuel the German war machine and line the pockets of Nazi officials. Factories were repurposed for war production, and local populations were subjected to forced labor. Resistance, though ruthlessly crushed, simmered beneath the surface, fueled by the flames of defiance and the yearning for freedom. Underground movements, though fragmented and often isolated, continued to fight against the oppressive regime, risking their lives for the hope of liberation. The new order represented a fundamental reshaping of the European continent, a brutal distortion of its values and ideals. Cities and towns were transformed into symbols of Nazi power, with swastikas flying over government buildings and public spaces. It was a dark chapter in human history, a stark reminder of the human capacity for cruelty and oppression. The legacy of this period is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring fight for justice and human rights. The post-war trials and memorials serve as a solemn reminder of the atrocities committed and the importance of remembering history to prevent its repetition.